A bitter first encounter. Aiden Carr had always been the type of officer who believed in the value of hard work. A 35-year-old white man, he had climbed the ranks of the police force over the years through sheer dedication and persistence. He had sacrificed much, long hours, sleepless nights, and the constant pressure to prove himself. He didn't have the luxury of shortcuts. Everything he had achieved was the result of his own grit. Yet, as Aiden entered the precinct that morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was just a regular day, or so he thought. Aiden stepped into the station with his usual stride, his uniform perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a shine. The familiar smell of coffee and printer ink filled the air as he walked through the hallway, nodding at his colleagues. His mind was focused on the day ahead, case files to go through, calls to attend, and, of course, the hope that today might finally bring him the recognition he had long deserved. But just as Aiden reached the door to the briefing room, it swung open. A man walked in, tall, confident, and radiating a sense of purpose that instantly drew attention. Riker Bennett was not someone Aiden had ever seen before. He had the kind of presence that made people pause, his every step calculated and assured. His deep brown eyes, framed by a chiseled jawline, gave him an almost regal quality. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught Aiden off guard, it was the way he carried himself. Riker didn't seem to be in any rush. He was calm, collected, his every movement deliberate. His posture exuded quiet strength, and he walked into the precinct with a sense of familiarity, as if he belonged there in a way that Aiden never could. Aiden, taken aback by this stranger's entrance, couldn't help but feel an immediate surge of frustration. Who was this man? Why did he feel like he was walking into their space as if he owned it? Aiden felt his grip on his folder tighten as he watched Riker. As Riker reached the door to the briefing room, he turned back to acknowledge Aiden, offering a small, respectful nod. "Thank you," Riker said simply, his tone polite, but there was something about the way he said it that struck Aiden like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the words, it was the underlying confidence in Riker's voice. He was treating Aiden, an officer who had been working at the station for years, like an equal. The brief exchange sent a rush of heat to Aiden's face. He stood frozen for a second, the muscles in his neck tightening. A wave of anger flooded his body, leaving no room for rational thought. Without thinking, he reached forward, grabbing Riker by the collar, his fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Aiden spat, his voice filled with venom. "You don't walk in here like that. You think you're above us all? A criminal, maybe? Are you turning yourself in?" Aiden's breath was heavy, and his pulse pounded in his temples. He had never felt such a surge of anger, but Riker's composure, his calmness, only made it worse. Aiden's grip tightened, and he felt a primal need to assert dominance, to remind this stranger of his place. He wasn't going to let some newcomer walk all over him, regardless of how well-dressed or composed they seemed. But Riker didn't flinch. He didn't fight back. Instead, he locked eyes with Aiden, his expression unchanged. It was almost as if he were sizing Aiden up, not with malice, but with quiet understanding. For a moment, Aiden felt a flicker of doubt. "Don't act so arrogant," Riker said calmly, his voice steady and even. "You don't know who I am, so watch your mouth." Aiden recoiled slightly, as if the words had physically struck him. Riker's calm response cut through the haze of rage that clouded his judgment. It felt like a challenge to his authority, to his ego, to his very sense of self. But before Aiden could respond, the sound of a voice broke through the tension. "What the hell are you doing, Aiden?" Officer Brian Donovan, a fellow white officer, appeared at Aiden's side. His voice was sharp, filled with disbelief, and he quickly stepped between the two men, placing a firm hand on Aiden's shoulder. Donovan's presence served as an anchor, pulling Aiden out of his head and back into reality. He slowly released his grip on Riker's collar, though the anger inside him had not dissipated. Donovan turned to Riker, his tone shifting instantly to one of respect. "Sir, I had no idea you were coming in today," he said, offering a polite nod. "Please, forgive the misunderstanding." Aiden felt his stomach churn as Donovan's words registered. "Sir?" He glanced at Riker, whose calm demeanor had not faltered. There was a certain warmth in Riker's eyes, an understanding that was both comforting and disconcerting. Aiden's fists clenched involuntarily, his pride wounded. "You don't know who he is, do you, Aiden?" Donovan continued, his voice now laced with a touch of reproach. "That's Riker Bennett, the governor's son-in-law." Aiden froze. His heart skipped a beat as the weight of Donovan's words sank in. The governor's son-in-law? Aiden felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had just accosted the man who had the kind of influence that Aiden could only dream of. His mind raced, replaying the last few seconds of the encounter, and for the first time in a long while, he felt humiliated. Before Aiden could form a response, Donovan turned to Riker, his entire demeanor shifting to one of deference. "Welcome, sir," Donovan said with a smile, his voice full of respect. "It's an honor to have you here. We're all looking forward to working with you." Aiden stood frozen, his thoughts a whirlwind. The realization that he had just humiliated himself in front of a man with such power hit him like a truck. He felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, and the room around him seemed to shrink. Every officer present turned their attention to Riker, offering him warm greetings and nods of respect. Meanwhile, Aiden remained still, his face flushed with anger and shame. How could this be happening? How could a man like Riker, someone who had done nothing to earn his position in Aiden's eyes, be welcomed with open arms, while Aiden, who had worked tirelessly for his own rank, was left standing on the sidelines, overshadowed by this man's connections? As the officers gathered around Riker, eager to make him feel welcome, Aiden found himself drifting further into isolation. His colleagues were hanging on Riker's every word, treating him with a level of respect that Aiden had always yearned for but could never quite achieve. It was as if Riker had already claimed his place among them, and Aiden was just an afterthought. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout, to lash out. The bitter taste of injustice lingered in his mouth. He couldn't understand it. How had Riker, a man with no experience, risen to such a prominent position? How could he simply waltz into the station, his wife's influence paving the way for him, while Aiden had to struggle every step of the way? But as the day wore on, Aiden's resentment only deepened. Every passing moment seemed to solidify Riker's place at the station. Officers who had once looked to Aiden for guidance now turned to Riker. The younger man, it seemed, was everything Aiden had worked so hard to be: calm, collected, and effortlessly charismatic. And it stung. It stung more than Aiden cared to admit. In the quiet of his office, Aiden stared at the stack of case files on his desk, his mind far from the work in front of him. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by one thing: Riker Bennett. How could this man, with his privileged background and political ties, be the one now calling the shots? How could someone like him have so much control, while Aiden was left to fight for scraps? The feeling of powerlessness washed over Aiden, and the seeds of jealousy and resentment began to take root. This wasn't just about the job, about the position, it was about everything Aiden had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. He couldn't let this black man, this privileged outsider, take everything he had earned. In that moment, Aiden made a decision: he would do whatever it took to bring Riker down. The struggle for power had only just begun. Rising tension. As the days went by, the uncomfortable reality of Riker Bennett's position as the new chief of the precinct began to settle in for Aiden. He had tried to shake off the feelings of inadequacy, but every time Riker passed him in the hallways or stood in front of a group, commanding their attention with ease, Aiden's resentment grew. Riker was everything Aiden could have been, if not for his lack of family connections, if not for the old boys network that continued to shut him out at every turn. At first, Aiden tried to push past his bitterness. After all, he had been trained to rise above petty emotions. But every meeting, every encounter with Riker chipped away at his resolve. Riker had a calm, natural authority about him. He didn't need to bark orders to be heard, he simply spoke, and people listened. His mere presence carried weight in a way Aiden could never have imagined. What was worse was that Riker didn't rub it in anyone's face. He was gracious, humble, and approachable, qualities that made him all the more dangerous in Aiden's eyes. The precinct had quickly adapted to Riker's leadership. His first week on the job had been a whirlwind of introductions, handshakes, and briefings. Riker's strategies were clear and methodical. He wasn't in a rush to change the status quo immediately, but there was no mistaking that he wanted to make an impact. Every officer felt it. The steady shift in power, the subtle changes in how cases were prioritized, and the way Riker sought input from everyone, even the most junior officers, set him apart. He was not just managing the precinct, he was molding it in his image, and Aiden could feel it. But Aiden couldn't let go of the notion that Riker hadn't earned his place. Yes, he was married to the governor's daughter, but Aiden had worked for years to prove himself. He had played by the rules, suffered the slights, done the work, only to see a man with far less experience take the reins simply because of who he was married to. Riker, it seemed, had done everything right in the eyes of the people who mattered. He was the type of officer that the upper brass could get behind. As the days went on, Aiden's bitterness evolved into something more dangerous. It was no longer just jealousy, it was a deep, simmering hatred. How could Riker come in here, so polished and composed, and take everything that Aiden had been striving for his entire career? The frustration gnawed at him during every briefing, every quiet moment alone. One afternoon, Aiden found himself sitting in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee. His eyes were locked on Riker, who was holding court with several other officers at the far side of the room. Riker had that easy smile on his face, the kind that made people trust him even when they didn't know why. Aiden didn't care for it. He couldn't stand the way Riker commanded such adoration from the others, the way they looked at him like he was some kind of hero. It was all so artificial, built on the foundation of his wife's family name, not merit. Aiden's jaw tightened as he looked away, his mind racing. He had always played by the rules, always done what was expected of him. And what did he have to show for it? Nothing. Riker, on the other hand, was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His place in the precinct was cemented from the moment he stepped in. He had everything handed to him, except for the respect of officers like Aiden, who had worked their entire lives for a fraction of that privilege. The resentment boiled inside him, and for the first time, Aiden felt a stirring of something darker. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just stand by and let Riker take over like this. He had to show everyone, especially Riker, that he was more than just a name on a piece of paper, more than just someone who had connections. Aiden had the skill, the knowledge, and the experience to prove that he deserved the promotion that Riker had gotten so easily. That afternoon, the tension between the two men was palpable. Aiden found himself more distant than ever from his colleagues, who continued to fawn over Riker. The subtle divide between them grew, and Aiden found himself lurking in the shadows, silently plotting his next move. He knew that Riker would make mistakes, that's how things worked. No one was perfect, no matter how impressive their resume might be. Riker had to slip up eventually. When that moment came, Aiden would be ready. As the week wore on, Aiden's focus shifted from his work to finding an opportunity to undermine Riker. It wasn't just about the promotion anymore, it was about taking back the control that he had lost. He needed to remind everyone that the work he had put in over the years was worth more than any political favor. The perfect opportunity arrived just as the precinct was preparing for a major bust, a raid on a drug ring operating out of an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The intelligence was solid, but it had taken weeks of planning, careful surveillance, and coordination with other law enforcement agencies. The raid was set for the middle of the night, and Riker had already briefed the team on the plan. He had made it clear that no one was to act without orders, everything had to go according to plan. Patience was key. Aiden didn't share Riker's patience. He didn't have time to sit around and wait. He had been in the force long enough to know that in this line of work, hesitation meant failure. And so, when he saw an opportunity to act earlier than planned, he made his decision. That night, Aiden was assigned to a nearby observation post. The plan was simple: everyone would wait for the gang members to arrive at the warehouse, and then they would close in together. Aiden, however, had different ideas. He had been watching the gang leader for days, noting his patterns and routines. At this point, Aiden had memorized the leader's schedule and knew that he often arrived alone for brief meetings with other gang members. There was no reason to wait, no reason to stick to the plan. Aiden was convinced that if he struck first, if he captured the gang leader on his own, it would prove that he was more than just an officer who followed orders. He would show Riker and the rest of the department that he was a leader in his own right. Against protocol, Aiden slipped away from the observation post and made his way to the warehouse. The rest of the team had no idea what he was doing. Riker had told them to wait, but Aiden knew that this was his moment. He approached the warehouse quietly, making sure to stay out of sight, his heart pounding in his chest. He spotted the gang leader standing outside, talking to an associate. Without thinking, Aiden acted. He rushed forward, pulling his gun and shouting for the gang leader to freeze. The gang leader, caught off guard, turned quickly, his eyes narrowing as he reached for his own weapon. Aiden tackled him, forcing him to the ground, keeping a firm hold on the man's wrist as he tried to struggle free. The whole situation was escalating rapidly. Aiden could hear the sirens in the distance, his team would be here soon. But as the struggle continued, Aiden's thoughts were consumed by one thing: he had done it. He had caught the gang leader on his own, without waiting for orders, and that would make him the hero of the operation. But what Aiden didn't know was that the warehouse had been rigged with explosives. The moment he made his move, he unknowingly triggered a trap set by the gang. The blast would change everything. The breaking point. The world around Aiden seemed to fall apart in an instant. One moment, he was grappling with the gang leader, the rush of adrenaline pumping through his veins. The next, everything was chaos: explosions, shouts, and blinding light filled the air as the entire warehouse seemed to shake under the force of the blast. The shockwave threw Aiden off his feet, sending him sprawling across the ground. His ears rang from the explosion, his body feeling as if it had been struck by a freight train. He couldn't breathe, couldn't hear anything beyond the ringing in his ears. His chest felt heavy, the air thick and suffocating as dust and debris filled the space. The only thing Aiden could do was gasp for air, his hands scrambling at the ground, trying to push himself up. For a moment, everything was silent. Time seemed to stand still. Then, the coughing and wheezing began. Aiden hacked uncontrollably, trying to clear the smoke from his lungs, but it felt like his chest was being crushed. He couldn't focus. His mind was foggy, his senses overwhelmed. He felt disoriented, as though his body was no longer his own. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, the pain from the blast radiating through his body. His hand reached out blindly, scraping against the concrete floor, desperate for something solid to hold on to. His fingers found nothing but rubble and jagged edges. Panic surged within him, and for a brief moment, he thought he might be trapped, unable to move. But then, through the haze, he saw movement. Riker. Through the dust and smoke, Aiden saw Riker emerging from the shadows. His uniform was torn, his face bloodied, but he was alive. His eyes locked onto Aiden's, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something: concern, maybe even sympathy. Aiden couldn't tell. But Riker didn't hesitate. He rushed toward Aiden, pulling him to his feet with surprising strength. "We have to get out of here." Riker shouted over the sounds of debris crashing around them, his voice firm and urgent. Aiden wanted to protest. He wanted to lash out, to tell Riker that this was his fault, that if Riker had just stuck to the plan, they wouldn't be in this mess. But the words never came. Instead, he let Riker pull him along, his mind too clouded with confusion and pain to do anything else. The heat of the fire that had erupted in the wake of the explosion was intense, and the acrid smoke stung Aiden's eyes. Every step felt like a struggle, the weight of his own body a reminder of the damage he had taken. His chest burned with each breath, and he could feel the ache of bruises forming all over his body. He had no idea how much time had passed since the explosion, but the urgency in Riker's movements told him that every second counted. They stumbled through the wreckage, debris falling from above and blocking their path, but Riker never faltered. He was focused, calculating, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger as they made their way toward the exit. Aiden followed, barely able to keep up, the pain in his body screaming at him to stop, but he pushed on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the door to the warehouse, the heat and smoke becoming unbearable. Riker kicked the door open, and they were met with the cool, crisp night air. The relief was immediate, but it was also short-lived. They had escaped the fire, but the damage was done. Aiden could hear the distant sound of sirens, the rush of emergency vehicles closing in on the scene. Aiden collapsed to the ground outside, his legs finally giving out. He gasped for air, trying to steady his breathing, his body trembling with the effort to recover. Riker crouched beside him, his face unreadable, though there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You okay?" Riker asked, his voice softer now, the harshness of the earlier moments gone. Aiden nodded weakly, though the truth was, he felt far from okay. He had barely escaped with his life, and the weight of what had just happened was starting to sink in. They had been lucky, far too lucky. As the rest of the team arrived at the scene, chaos erupted. Officers swarmed around, securing the perimeter, assessing the damage. Aiden's mind began to clear as he surveyed the aftermath of the explosion, the full scope of the destruction hitting him like a freight train. The warehouse was a wreck, and a number of their own officers had been close to the blast. The situation was grave. Aiden's thoughts were still muddled, his head spinning from the shock of it all, but there was one thing he couldn't shake: he had nearly died. And it wasn't just him. It was Riker too. In the chaos that followed, the gang leader was taken into custody. Despite the damage, despite the explosion, they had succeeded in capturing one of the key players in a major drug ring. But the victory was hollow for Aiden. His stomach twisted as he realized how close they had come to losing everything. He had been reckless, acting without waiting for orders, and it had nearly cost them all. Aiden stood up slowly, his knees weak beneath him. Riker had already moved on, overseeing the rest of the operation with efficiency. The others were already assessing the damage to the warehouse and coordinating with the medical team to tend to the injured. No one seemed to be paying much attention to Aiden. No one except Riker. Riker looked up, his expression unreadable. Aiden opened his mouth, about to offer some kind of apology, but the words stuck in his throat. The truth was, Aiden wasn't sure what to say. He had let his emotions drive him to make a reckless decision, and now he had to live with the consequences. But Riker didn't give him the chance to say anything. Instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging Aiden's failure without the need for words. There was no anger in Riker's eyes, no sense of triumph. Only a quiet, steady resolve. "You should have waited for backup," Riker said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "But you didn't, and we got lucky." Aiden swallowed hard, the weight of Riker's words sinking in. He had made a mistake. A costly mistake. And while Riker wasn't rubbing it in his face, Aiden couldn't escape the truth: he had risked their lives for the sake of his own pride. In that moment, Aiden realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. He had been so consumed by his resentment of Riker, so focused on proving himself, that he had forgotten the most important thing, the mission. He had let his ego blind him to the bigger picture, and it had nearly destroyed everything. Aiden took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: the game had changed. No longer could he rely on his pride or the belief that hard work would always win out. There was something deeper at play now, something more complex than a simple rivalry. Riker wasn't just the governor's son-in-law. He was a leader, one who commanded respect through his actions, not his name. Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something bigger. Something that would force him to confront not only his own insecurities but also his perception of power, leadership, and what it truly meant to be in charge. But for now, he could only stand in the wreckage, a part of him still reeling from the blast, and wonder what the future would hold. A price to pay. 2 months had passed since the explosion at the warehouse. Time moved differently in the hospital. Days blurred into nights, and Aiden found himself caught in an endless cycle of pain, medication, and brief moments of lucidity. His body, a mass of bruises, burns, and broken bones, had been patched up by skilled surgeons, but the physical scars would take far longer to heal. The mental ones, though, were proving to be even more stubborn. Aiden woke up in the hospital bed, disoriented, his senses flooded with the faint smell of antiseptic and the harsh beeping of a heart monitor. His body felt heavy, stiff, and sore, like every joint and muscle was rebelling against him. He tried to move, but the pain was immediate, a sharp, unrelenting throb that shot through his chest and limbs. He gasped, struggling to catch his breath, but it was impossible. His mind was still foggy, still trapped somewhere between the explosion and the present. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, focusing on the sound of his own pulse. But no matter how hard he tried to pull himself together, he couldn't shake the memories. The blast. The warehouse. The fire. The realization that it could have all ended in an instant. He could have been dead. He could have been nothing more than a name on a list of casualties. But Aiden was alive, and that, in itself, was a strange kind of gift. He didn't know how long he'd been out, but he could feel the weight of the silence pressing in around him. He opened his eyes again, and that's when he saw Riker. Riker was standing at the foot of his bed, his posture straight, his face as calm as it had always been. He was no longer the man who had walked into the precinct and made Aiden feel like a fool. Now, there was something else in Riker's eyes, something more personal, more real. Aiden noticed it immediately. It wasn't just concern, it was understanding, as if Riker had been where Aiden was, once upon a time. "How are you feeling?" Riker asked softly, his voice warm but professional. Aiden didn't respond right away. He felt the lump in his throat, the bitterness threatening to spill out. But instead of lashing out, he just shook his head, his eyes avoiding Riker's gaze. The truth was, he didn't know how he was feeling. How could he? His body was in shambles, and his mind was even worse. Every moment spent in this hospital bed reminded him of the mistake he had made, and of how lucky he was to still be breathing. "I should have waited," Aiden muttered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I should have followed the plan." Riker's face softened, but he didn't say anything at first. He simply took a step closer, pulling a chair up beside Aiden's bed. "You did what you thought was right," Riker said, his tone steady but reassuring. "You were trying to stop something dangerous. But sometimes, even when we have the best intentions, things go wrong. That's not your fault." Aiden's jaw clenched at Riker's words. It wasn't that he didn't know they were true, it was just hard to accept. He had been trained to make quick decisions, to act fast and with precision. He'd always been the one who jumped in when others hesitated. But this time, that instinct had failed him. It had nearly cost him his life and the lives of his colleagues. "Don't try to make it sound better than it is," Aiden replied bitterly, his voice strained. I should have waited for backup. You were right. I was just too eager. Too focused on proving myself. Riker paused for a moment, studying Aiden with a gaze that seemed to cut through the layers of guilt and frustration clouding his mind. I know how it feels, Riker finally said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. I've been there, too. Wanting to prove yourself. Wanting to be seen as capable, as strong. But the truth is, sometimes you have to trust the process. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Aiden. Not to me. Not to anyone else here. We all make mistakes, and it's how we handle them that matters. Aiden let out a heavy sigh, leaning back against the pillows. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want sympathy, didn't want a pep talk. He wanted to feel in control again. He wanted to feel like he had earned his place back. But the reality was that he hadn't. He had lost his edge, his confidence, and his standing. The explosive situation had shattered more than just his body, it had shaken his entire sense of self. He wasn't sure where he fit in anymore. All his life, he had believed that if you worked hard enough, you would eventually rise above the noise. But Riker's rise had shown him that sometimes, politics and connections mattered far more than effort. Still, Aiden couldn't help but feel a shift inside himself. Despite his pride, despite the animosity he had felt toward Riker, there was something undeniably genuine in Riker's words. Maybe Aiden had been so focused on being the best that he had forgotten the most important thing, being part of a team. As the days passed, Aiden found himself reluctantly beginning to listen. Riker didn't just give him words of comfort, he gave him something more, an example. Despite his calm, confident demeanor, Riker was not a man without flaws. He, too, had struggled in his rise to the top, faced the skepticism of those around him. Riker had earned his place not just by his political connections but by the decisions he made in the field, decisions that were not always the easiest, but were always thoughtful. Aiden started to realize that the world wasn't as black and white as he had once believed. There was more to leadership than just being in charge. Riker wasn't just a man of titles, he was a man who listened, who valued his team's input, who never hesitated to put himself at risk for those around him. Riker's strength didn't come from being the best, it came from knowing when to step back and allow others to lead. And slowly, as Aiden recovered, he began to reconsider his own approach to the job. It wasn't just about winning or proving something. It wasn't even about being the best. It was about understanding, about working together. Aiden had been so fixated on his own path to success that he had forgotten to look around and appreciate the teamwork that made success possible in the first place. Weeks turned into months, and Aiden's body slowly began to heal. The pain was still there, but it became more manageable with each passing day. The mental scars, however, took longer to fade. He had made peace with the fact that he had nearly lost his life, and more importantly, that he had almost cost others theirs. He still struggled with the feelings of inadequacy, of jealousy, but they didn't consume him the way they once had. One afternoon, as Aiden sat at his desk, going through case files and trying to get back into the rhythm of the job, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. Riker stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Got a minute?" he asked, his tone light but with a clear sense of purpose. Aiden nodded, setting down the file in his hand. "Of course. What's up?" Riker took a step closer, his gaze locking with Aiden's. There was no preamble, no hesitation. "I've been thinking," Riker began, "and I want you to be part of the next big operation we've got lined up. I need someone who knows the field, who's willing to take charge when needed. I want you to lead it." Aiden blinked in surprise, the words sinking in slowly. "Wait, you want me to lead it? After everything that happened?" Riker nodded, his expression steady. "I trust you, Aiden. It's not about the past. It's about the future. And I think you've learned what it means to work as part of a team." That's why I'm asking you. For a moment, Aiden was speechless. He had expected a lot of things over the course of his recovery, but never this. It wasn't just a second chance, it was recognition, validation of the hard work he had put in, and a sign that he had finally found his place. "Thank you," Aiden said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Riker smiled, and for the first time in a long while, Aiden felt a sense of hope, not just for the future of the operation, but for his own future on the Force. A new beginning. The days following Riker's offer to lead the next operation were filled with a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. Aiden's body was healing, but the scars that ran deeper, those of doubt, resentment, and lost pride, were harder to recover from. The fact that Riker had trusted him again was a surprise, but it was also a challenge. Aiden knew he had to prove himself, not just to Riker but to himself. This was his chance to finally put the mistakes of the past behind him and step into the leadership role he had always felt he deserved. The operation Riker had assigned to Aiden was a high-stakes mission. A notorious gang had been operating in the area for months, trafficking weapons and drugs. They had avoided capture, using a network of safe houses and encrypted communications to stay one step ahead of the authorities. The mission was complex, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and a carefully coordinated strike. Riker had made it clear that they had only one chance to get it right. Aiden spent the next several days poring over intelligence reports, briefing his team, and devising a strategy that would give them the upper hand. The pressure was immense, but he welcomed it. This was what he had worked for, the chance to take the lead, to make the decisions that would determine the outcome of the operation. But despite the outward calm, Aiden found himself battling the old doubts that had plagued him before. What if he wasn't ready? What if he made a mistake again? What if Riker was wrong to put his trust in him? Each night, as Aiden lay in bed, his mind raced with these questions, and the weight of responsibility threatened to crush him. He had come so far, but it felt like everything was hanging in the balance. On the eve of the operation, Riker pulled Aiden aside in the precinct's command center. The room was filled with maps, surveillance footage, and radios crackling with updates from their field agents. Officers moved with purpose, preparing for the mission ahead, but Riker seemed to have a moment of stillness about him. He stepped toward Aiden, his expression serious but calm. "You're ready," Riker said, his voice low, but filled with conviction. "I've seen the way you've handled things, how you've worked with the team. You're ready to lead this." Aiden didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to argue, to push back and insist that he wasn't ready, that there was too much at stake. But Riker's words were reassuring, grounding him in a way that few others could. Riker's confidence in him was a gift, and a challenge. He had no choice but to step up now. "Thanks," Aiden replied, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Riker nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder for a moment before walking away. Aiden watched him go, feeling the weight of his words sink in. He wasn't just leading an operation, he was leading a team that trusted him. It was no longer about Riker's connections or his own past failures. It was about doing the job, and doing it well. The operation began just after midnight, under the cover of darkness. Aiden and his team moved through the city with precision, their every step calculated and deliberate. The air was thick with tension, but Aiden felt an unusual sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't focused on his own insecurities. He was focused on the mission. Every decision mattered, and he was making them all. His heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. It was from purpose. The team reached the safe house where the gang members were believed to be hiding. Aiden's mind was sharp as he directed the officers into position. The intelligence was solid, the plan was in place, but there was still the chance of something going wrong. He had to remain vigilant, every second counting. "Hold your position," Aiden whispered into his radio, his voice steady. "We go in on my mark." As the minutes ticked by, Aiden's nerves began to edge closer to the surface. He glanced around at his team, their faces illuminated by the dim light of their flashlights. They looked to him for guidance, for strength. They were ready, but so was the enemy. Aiden couldn't afford to hesitate. "Mark," he said, his voice low but firm. The team moved like clockwork, sweeping through the building in a coordinated fashion. Aiden's heart pounded in his chest as they cleared each room, moving methodically through the space. He could hear the muffled sounds of voices up ahead, gang members, most likely. It was time. Aiden gave the signal, and the team burst into the final room. The element of surprise was on their side, and the gang members barely had time to react before they were subdued. The operation was a success. The weapons were seized, the drugs were confiscated, and the ringleaders were taken into custody. Aiden stood over the scene, his mind racing with the realization that they had done it. They had successfully dismantled one of the most dangerous gangs in the city. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the silence of victory, of accomplishment. Aiden felt a sense of pride swell within him. It wasn't just the success of the operation that felt good. It was the knowledge that he had led it, that he had made the right decisions when it counted most. This was his moment. Back at the precinct, the celebration was subdued but genuine. Officers congratulated Aiden, offering him nods of respect, pats on the back, and murmured praises. The operation had been clean, swift, and effective. Aiden had stepped up in a way that few had expected, but his leadership had been crucial to the success of the mission. Riker, as always, was calm in the midst of the chaos. He approached Aiden after the briefing, a slight smile on his face. The team had already dispersed, but Aiden and Riker stood in the center of the room, the weight of the night's events still settling over them. "You did great," Riker said simply, his voice warm. "I knew you had it in you." Aiden nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The pressure of the last few weeks had taken its toll, but now, standing before Riker, he could finally breathe. "Thanks," Aiden said, his voice steady, but filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without the team." Riker smiled, but there was a depth to his expression now, an acknowledgement of how far Aiden had come. It wasn't just the operation that had been a success. It was the way Aiden had stepped into his role, the way he had found his own sense of leadership, his own identity. Riker had believed in him from the start, but now, Aiden believed in himself. "You've come a long way," Riker said, his tone reflecting a quiet pride. "I knew you'd get there. This is just the beginning." Aiden met Riker's gaze, the weight of those words settling over him. He had started this journey with bitterness and doubt, with a fierce determination to prove himself. But now, he realized, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about being the kind of leader he could be proud of. It was about building trust, earning respect, and working as part of a team. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. As the night drew to a close, Aiden stepped out of the precinct into the cool, crisp air. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Aiden knew that he was ready for whatever came next. He had earned his place. And he wasn't going anywhere. The cost of power. Aiden's newfound sense of peace was short-lived. While the successful operation had been a significant achievement, the aftermath left him with something he hadn't anticipated, a growing sense of discomfort. It was as if the success, though deeply satisfying, had started to stir something within him, a need to prove that his leadership was not just about the latest win. He found himself questioning the next steps in a way he never had before. His shift in mindset had been subtle, but over the weeks that followed, it became more pronounced. There was a weight to his actions now, a feeling that each decision could have far-reaching consequences. As much as he had come to embrace the responsibility of leadership, he was starting to understand the true cost of power. The precinct had settled into a routine again, with Riker continuing to oversee operations and guide the team. Aiden, on the other hand, had begun to feel a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the pressure of his position, it was something else, something that was gnawing at him in the quiet moments between the demands of his work. The more Aiden reflected on his recent decisions, the more the cracks in his newfound confidence began to show. The fear that had once consumed him was being replaced with a different kind of fear, a fear of losing control. It was a Friday evening when everything came to a head. Aiden had just finished his shift when Riker stopped him in the parking lot as he was about to leave. The air was thick with tension, the night sky heavy with the promise of rain. Riker looked at him with that same steady expression, but there was something more in his eyes now, something harder. "You've been making a lot of waves lately," Riker said, his voice calm, but there was a noticeable edge to it. "I know you've been pushing for more autonomy with your team, but I'm not sure that the direction you're taking is the right one." Aiden felt a jolt of surprise. He had been expecting a congratulatory pat on the back, or at least a more positive assessment of his recent decisions. Instead, Riker was challenging him, questioning the very leadership he had worked so hard to build. "What do you mean?" Aiden asked, a slight frown creasing his brow. He had thought he was doing everything right, keeping his team focused, ensuring they followed protocol, and even pushing for improvements in the precinct's methods. Riker took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Aiden's. "I mean, you're playing a dangerous game, Aiden. You're isolating yourself from the rest of the team. Your approach, your methods, they're starting to become more about you than the mission." Aiden's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend his actions, but a part of him knew that Riker was right. He had been pushing the envelope, taking decisions into his own hands without consulting the team as much as he should. He had become so focused on proving himself, on solidifying his authority, that he had lost sight of the one thing that had brought him this far, teamwork. "I'm trying to do what's best for the precinct," Aiden said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I thought we needed more efficiency, more focus. The team needs direction, not hand-holding." Riker shook his head slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. "That's where you're wrong. Leadership isn't about doing things your way, it's about finding balance. It's about knowing when to step forward and when to let others take charge. Right now, Aiden, you're acting like it's all on your shoulders. And that's not sustainable." Aiden opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He didn't want to hear this, he didn't want to hear that his hard-won progress had somehow been undermined by his own actions. But as Riker's words echoed in his mind, he felt a shift in his gut, a painful realization that he had been too focused on leading from the front, at the expense of the very thing he had once valued, unity. Riker continued, his voice firm but understanding. "We all make mistakes, Aiden. But the thing is, you have to recognize when you've gone too far. You can't just steamroll over everything, thinking you're the only one who knows what's right. You have to trust your team. That's the only way we can succeed, together." Aiden stood still, staring at Riker, his mind racing. The guilt from the past months hit him like a wave, and for the first time since the explosion, he felt the full weight of his own shortcomings. He had been so consumed with proving his worth, so focused on making an impact, that he had forgotten to lead with humility. He had started to believe that his vision was the only vision that mattered. "I'm sorry," Aiden said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've been so focused on. I don't even know what. I lost sight of the bigger picture." Riker nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "You're not alone in this, Aiden. You never were. We've all got your back. But you need to remember that leadership isn't about control, it's about collaboration. You can't win this war on your own." Aiden felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, but the words still stung. They were a reminder that the road to true leadership wasn't as simple as being the loudest voice in the room or the one who made all the decisions. It was about balance, about knowing when to step back and let others contribute their strengths. "I'll do better," Aiden said, the sincerity in his voice evident. "I know I've been pushing too hard. I just wanted to prove that I could handle it." Riker placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that, for the first time, didn't feel like a challenge but an affirmation. "I know. And you will. But remember, this isn't a solo mission. You're part of something bigger now. Don't forget that." The conversation ended with no fanfare, but the weight of it lingered with Aiden long after he got in his car and drove home that night. Riker had given him a gift, an opportunity to reset, to reevaluate his approach. Aiden had been so driven to succeed, so determined to prove his worth that he had almost lost the essence of what leadership truly was. Now, he knew that the path forward wasn't about control. It was about trust, collaboration, and learning from others. The following weeks were a time of reflection and change. Aiden began to alter his approach, consciously making an effort to step back when necessary, to listen to his team, and to trust their judgment. He no longer saw leadership as something to be earned through individual effort. It was something that had to be shared, something that grew stronger when it was nurtured in collaboration. At first, his team was skeptical. They had seen Aiden as a driven, authoritative figure, and they weren't sure how to respond to his newfound openness. But over time, as Aiden proved his commitment to their success as a team, they began to trust him more. His willingness to delegate, to share responsibility, and to listen without judgment slowly won them over. But even as Aiden took strides toward a more balanced approach, he couldn't shake the realization that true leadership came with sacrifices. He had to sacrifice his need to always be in control, to push his vision ahead without regard for others. But more importantly, he had to sacrifice the notion that leadership was a destination. It wasn't something that could be conquered or won, it was a journey, a process of growth that never truly ended. And with every decision, every challenge, and every victory, Aiden began to understand that the cost of power wasn't in the titles or the accolades. It was in the humility it required, the trust it demanded, and the unwavering responsibility to always lead with integrity. In the end, Aiden didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had proven it to himself.